Okay, let's talk about focus and concentration and how you can improve your focus and concentration using science-based protocols. I'm mainly going to focus on what to do and when and how to do it. But I just want to take about 3 minutes and briefly describe a model that is a visual image that you can put in your mind that will help you incorporate the tools that I'll provide and that generally will help you understand at a mechanistic level how focus and concentration work. So what I want you to imagine is an arrow. And an arrow, of course, has an arrowhead and it has the shaft of that arrow. And in the context of the neuroscience of focus and concentration, the neurochemical system that really represents the shaft of that arrow, right, the straight line, is epinephrine, also called adrenaline. And today I'll refer to adrenaline and epinephrine interchangeably. It turns out that epinephrine/adrenaline are released within your brain from a little location, a little cluster of neurons called locus ceruleus, but you do not need to remember that name, and from your body from the adrenal glands. And the release of epinephrine from those two locations overall increases energy. It increases alertness. It does not alone increase focus. Okay, so the reason I've assigned epinephrine, adrenaline, as the shaft of the arrow is that if focus is the arrow, there is no focus without epinephrine. So things, whether or not they're behavioral or psychological or supplements or drugs that increase epinephrine, allow focus to occur. They are necessary for focus, but they are not sufficient for focus. That is, they are required, but they are not enough to create focus. So we're going to need epinephrine in the equation. Without epinephrine, there is no focus or concentration. Now, the arrowhead on this metaphorical arrowhead that represents focus and concentration is going to be represented or related to the mechanisms of acetylcholine, a different neurochemical that also exists in the brain and body. In fact, in the body, it's responsible for the contraction and movement of your muscles. But today we're talking about acetylcholine not in that context, but rather in the context of its release within the brain. Acetylcholine is released from a couple of different locations in the brain, and the best way to think about it is it's like a spotlight. It highlights specific neurons, nerve cells that should be active, or more active, I should say, than the other neurons in the environment. So the reason I've assigned the arrowhead to acetylcholine and acetylcholine to the arrowhead is that if you have an arrow with a very big arrowhead that's really broad, really blunt, imagine a mile-wide arrowhead, that's not very focused on any one location. It's not really pointing to any one location, is it? But with a narrow, really tightly focused arrowhead, well, that's focused on one location. So we have alertness, epinephrine, and then we have the actual direction in which our concentration and focus is placed, and that's, at least in this mental model, I'm creating acetylcholine. And then, in order to have ongoing focus, we need another neurochemical. And it turns out that that third neurochemical is dopamine, a molecule often associated with pleasure and reward, but it's really the molecule of motivation. So here I want you to imagine in your mind an arrow with an arrowhead, think acetylcholine in the arrowhead, a shaft or a line behind that arrowhead, which is epinephrine, also called adrenaline, and then behind it, a sort of an engine that keeps that focus moving forward, right? Because we don't just want to be focused for a moment, we want to be able to focus for 10 minutes or for an hour, or maybe even for 2 hours. But these three neurochemicals together, acetylcholine, epinephrine, and dopamine, really allow you to get focused, to focus very precisely, and in fact, increasingly precisely over time, to really narrow and narrow and narrow your focus progressively within a single bout of focus, and to continue to do that and to be able to do that repeatedly whenever you want. But in a moment or two, I'll start transitioning to discussing tools in which I'll talk about increasing dopamine and acetylcholine, or increasing epinephrine and dopamine in various combinations with various approaches. Next, I'd like to talk about compounds that can improve concentration and focus. And these are most often consumed as supplements, although some of them, I should mention, can also be derived from food. One of the key compounds that supports concentration and focus, because it generally supports mood, concentration, and focus and brain function in general, are the omega-3 essential fatty acids. And it's really clear that getting somewhere between 1 and 3 grams of EPA, that is 1 to 3 grams of EPA essential fatty acid per day, can improve outcomes, that is, can improve mood and can improve cognitive function. You can get those EPAs from other sources besides supplements, of course, but supplements are going to be the easiest way to do that. You can do that through liquid form, fish oil, cod liver oil. Some people who are vegan opt for other sources of EPAs. You can find those out there. Certainly, some people even use prescription EPAs to get the dosage really high. So I'll leave it to you as to whether or not you supplement with omega-3 fatty acids in order to get that 1 to 3 grams per day, or whether or not you do it through food. But I would encourage you to try and reach that threshold, because there are a number of known positive effects for mood and brain function generally. There are other ways to increase epinephrine in the brain and body besides, and in fact, that has been studied. There's an excellent study that was carried out not that long ago on how stress itself can increase our ability to focus and concentrate. That's right, how stress itself can increase focus and concentration. Most people think of stress as impairing our ability to focus, but that's actually not true. When we are stressed, it involves the deployment, the release of adrenaline, epinephrine, and that adrenaline both changes our visual field. In other words, it narrows our vision to a more tunnel-like focus. That is, it makes the arrow in our metaphor of the arrow more sharp, and it improves our concentration. So one of my favorite studies that really illustrates how stress can improve concentration and performance, it's a paper published in the journal Experimental Psychology in 2020. The title of the paper is, not surprisingly, Acute Stress Improves Concentration Performance. Now, of course, there are other ways to increase stress levels and to do that in healthy ways to improve concentration and performance. And one of the best ways to do that, because it's so surefire and it's generally safe, provided you do it safely, is deliberate cold exposure. This is something I've talked about on the podcast before, but deliberate cold exposure can be achieved by getting into a cold shower for 1 to 5 minutes. If you're not used to it, you probably want to start with 1 minute, or you can get into an ice bath. And nowadays there are a number of different commercial sources of circulating cold water, or if you have access to a body of cold water like a lake or a pool or an ocean, we know that getting into cold water or under cold water greatly increases epinephrine levels and dopamine levels in the brain and blood. There's a beautiful study that was published in the European Journal of Physiology that showed that the increases in dopamine are massive, a near doubling or more of dopamine levels that are very long lasting for hours. And epinephrine and indeed cortisol levels are also increased, and in ways that support not just immune system function, because they do that, and mood, because it does that, but that can really improve concentration and focus. So if one wants to increase the amount of dopamine transmission in the brain and body for sake of increasing concentration and focus, one of the most efficient ways to do that is by ingestion of the amino acid L-tyrosine. Again, L-tyrosine can be derived from food sources. I invite you to look up those various food sources on the web. Simply go to a web browser and put in foods that contain a lot of L-tyrosine, and you'll get a rich array of choices to select from. But in my case, I use L-tyrosine in capsule form. I will take 500 milligrams of L-tyrosine and a cup of coffee. I'm careful to do this early in the day, certainly not after 2 or 3 p.m., because I don't want to diminish my ability to fall and stay asleep that night. I'll do this early in the day before a workout or before a bout of concentrated mental work.